Hi guys, and welcome back to the Redcoat History Podcast, the show for history geeks, people like us who want to dive deep into a subject and learn all about it from the inside out. I'm Parkinson, a filmmaker, photographer, and sometime battlefield explorer, although that's a rather grand term really for someone who just likes walking around old battlefields. Originally I'm from the UK, but now I live in South Africa. But I still love my country and its armed forces, and this podcast is my attempt to share the stories of the great battles, the little known wars, and the men who put the great into Great Britain. In today's episode we're going to march into battle at Nyezane, fought on the same day as Isandlwana. We'll see the Gatling gun used in combat by the British for the first time, share the hardships of the men besieged at Eshowe, and meet some fascinating characters, including the white man who was a Zulu chief and had 49 wives. When one thinks of the 22nd of January 1879, inevitably thoughts turn to the terrible defeat at Isandlwana, the subsequent engagement at Rorke's Drift, and the 11 VCs won in its defence. But did you know that the British fought another battle on the same day? A battle often forgotten, a successful battle against a superior force of Zulus who attacked an advancing British column in the open. The Battle of Nyezane and the subsequent siege and relief of Eshowe are often overlooked by historians of the Anglo Zulu War, the monuments and graves little visited, and the memoirs of those involved rarely consulted. Well, on today's episode of the Redcoat History Podcast, I intend to put that right. So, fix bayonets and prepare to advance as we explore this little known but very important aspect of the war against the Zulus. If you haven't already listened to them, I highly recommend downloading the first 3 episodes of this podcast and hearing all about the reasons for war and the battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. We've already heard of the disaster that struck the central column at Isandlwana, but what of the other two? In the north was Colonel Wood and his left flank or number 4 column, who we shall hear much more about in next month's episode. But for today's story we're focusing on number 1 column, also known as the right flank or coastal column, which was commanded by Colonel Charles Knight Pearson of the 3rd Regiment of Foot, the Buffs. Originally from Yeovil, Pearson had served with distinction in the Crimea. He had recently retired and gone on to half pay, but the promise of a war with the Zulus had lured him from his relaxation. Under his command for the invasion were 8 companies of his own regiment, the Buffs, and 6 companies of the 99th Regiment. The Buffs were hardened campaigners who had been in Africa now for a while, whereas the 99th were young lads, many of them straight out of training in the UK. He had a squadron of mounted infantry, who were volunteers from various infantry regiments who knew how to ride. Alongside them were 5 small local volunteer units of irregular cavalry, like the Natal Hussars. There was also a regiment of black NNC troops, Natal Native Contingent, under Major Graves, and a naval brigade of around 290 men from HMS Shah and HMS Active, who were equipped with a hand-cranked, multi-barrelled Gatling gun and 2 heavy rocket tubes. For artillery, Pearson had 2 7-pounders and some more rockets. His engineering element was No. 2 Company Royal Engineers under Captain Warren Wynne and a company of native pioneers. In total, his force numbered around 4,200 men, including over 1,000 redcoats. It was a strong column. Pearson's instructions from Lord Chelmsford were to advance as quickly as possible towards the recently abandoned Norwegian mission station at Eshowe. It was one of the few permanently walled structures in the region. There he would entrench it, garrison it, and pack it full of supplies before advancing, in conjunction with the other columns, towards Ulundi, the seat of the Zulu king Cetshwayo's power. But as the central column pushed across the border on the 11th of January 1879, Pearson's was stuck at the lower Tugela Drift. His supplies had been slowed by the bad weather. His ponts for the crossing had been damaged and needed repairs, and the 99th Regiment, fresh off the boats from England, was still en route from Durban. As an aside here, I've been to the crossing point, and it is a beautiful place, though slightly spoiled by the constant traffic streaming across the modern N2 highway. On the Natal bank, on top of a steep-sided cliff, Pearson had built a fort named after himself and equipped with 2 Armstrong 12-pounder guns brought by the Naval Brigade. The fort is still there and is well worth a visit. It's also right next door to the ultimatum tree, where, as you might recall from episode 1, the British laid down their list of demands for the Zulu chiefs. But it was the northern side of the river that concerned Pearson. If the crossing point wasn't secured strongly, or the men took too long getting across, then it could give the Zulus an opportunity to hit them hard and derail the entire expedition. Lieutenant Hamilton of HMS Active recalled, "We crossed the river in boats at 4:30 a.m. We hauled the first company of the Buffs over at 5. Next came 100 of the native regiment, who relieved us on the hauling line. We then kept boats going, leaving a party of bluejackets to show the natives what they had to do. By 8 a.m. the whole of the Buffs were across. Then came the mounted volunteers, baggage for the Buffs, and 4 companies of the 99th. One of the few chroniclers of this campaign who I've been able to draw on for first-person testimony is a rather dashing fellow of the 31st Huntingdonshire Regiment called Captain Fitzroy Hart. He was a special service officer sent from the UK to work as the staff officer to Major Graves, who, as you may recall, commanded the 2nd Regiment of the NNC in Pearsons Column. A steel hawser, by the way, I had to Google what that was, but it turns out it's a thick rope for mooring or towing, had been stretched over the river by the Naval Brigade, and a ferry boat large enough to take the heaviest laden wagon had been built, and this boat or raft was dragged backwards and forwards from bank to bank by ropes, pulled sometimes by our natives, sometimes by bullocks. The boat being all the while attached to the steel hawser. The operation of crossing in this manner was necessarily tedious, but I dare say it was the most expeditious manner, since any bridge able to stand the force of the current would have to be made of a size and strength that I think would have required more time than was occupied by ferrying across. But despite the concerns, there wasn't an attack from the Zulus, the only sign of them being a handful of scouts and spies. To make the position more secure, a new fort, Fort Tenedos, was now built on the Zululand side of the river. It took the best part of a week to get Pearsons Column across, and, keen to get cracking, Pearson split his force into 2 elements. He commanded the lead section, a flying column that travelled light and hoped to make it to Eshowe as quickly as possible. Lieutenant Colonel Wellman of the 99th, with 80 wagons, was to follow a day later. It was hoped that splitting the force like this could allow a faster advance and mean less damage to the wet track that they were about to follow. But the weather was still terrible. It was rainy and unhealthy. The terrain, though, was slightly easier than that faced by the other columns. The features weren't as steep or as rocky, and the rolling hills were dotted with lush trees and intersected by the silvery threads of clear streams. The road, or track, was often referred to as Dunn's Road, named after a white man called John Dunn, who was well known in these parts. We'll come back to meet him properly later, as he still has a big part to play in our account of the fighting along the coast. He's a real character. Captain Hart and the 1st Battalion of his regiment was with the lead column as they set off early on the morning of the 18th. At mid-afternoon they reached the Inyoni River, and his letter home gives a great sense of the atmosphere that prevailed and the precautions taken against a Zulu attack. No signs of the enemy had been observed, but we took every precaution, carefully guarding our flanks and rear against surprise. On arrival in camp, wagons are collected on the best defensive ground. The oxen turned out to graze, but all collected before dark, and the alarm post of every part of the force assigned. Before sunset, we all take up our positions of defence for practice, and at 3 a.m., just 2 hours before daylight, we silently occupy these alarm posts, and there remain under arms until daybreak. This is done because the Zulus are apt to attack at such times, and it is considered essential to our safety to be able to receive them in the darkness. This we do every night. At 3 a.m. one is in one's deepest sleep, and to turn out then, often in the rain, and remain awake for nearly 2 hours is equally obnoxious to white man and black. A curious sound composed of 1,000 coughs, yawns, and sneezes, unrestrained, satisfies the commander that his camp is awake, and may, for all we know, have stopped the Zulu in his advance. Dunn's road was rapidly turning into a muddy morass, and Pearson decided to let the rear section of the column close the gap as they moved forward again. As they advanced deeper into Zulu territory, there was more signs of the inevitable Zulu response. Lieutenant Julius Backhouse of the Buffs recalled, "An alarm last night which proved to be a false one, although I believe some Zulus were about. A dispatch came from Mr. Finney, the border agent, to say that Hetwayo had sent one regiment to oppose us at Eshowe. We marched at 1:30 p.m. to Umsindusi River, where we halted for the night after having to ford the river, which was up to our waists. I was on outpost duty all night, which luckily was fine, although we had rain nearly all day. There were Zulu spies about. I saw 50 on a hill as we marched into camp before dark, my company being on rear guard. I had a lively night of it, as I was wet through and had to patrol in front of the sentries during the night, deep into the thick bush." It's interesting and telling how little respect the British commanders had for the Zulus at this time, that despite the possibility of a Zulu attack on the camp, there was no attempt to laager the wagons or dig entrenchments. In fact, with hindsight, the British position was actually incredibly vulnerable, spread out on two sides of a river with the troops unevenly distributed. If the Zulus had attacked, then things may have turned out very badly for Colonel Pearson and his column. The Zulu force that opposed Pearson wasn't the main Zulu impi. That was already en route for Isandlwana. But Hetwayo sent a small force of around 3,500 men to harass Pearson, as well as a number of local men from the region. In total, the Zulu commander, Chief Godide Kaandlela, had around 6,000 men under his command, a large proportion of them older warriors in their 30s and above. By the 20th, this force was in the area and looking for its opportunity to attack. And attack they did, on the morning of the 22nd of January. As with all my descriptions of battles, I highly recommend that you go to my website, www.redcoathistory.com, and take the time to look at the maps and photographs there, as well as the video I made on this ground a few years ago. It will really help you to understand the narrative and the flow of the battle better. I know for me, just hearing or reading it can be hard. I like to look at maps and watch videos. But anyway, back to the story. The British hadn't advanced far from the previous night's bivouac when they were forced to cross the Nyezane River. It was a narrow stretch of water, but was waist deep and had tricky banks thick with bush. Fleet Surgeon Norbury of the Naval Brigade gives us a good description of the countryside in this area. He says, "We started from our camping ground at 5 a.m, passing through a low-lying, rather swampy country covered with mealies. There was a prominent hill a few miles in advance, on the summit of which were seen some half-dozen Zulus. Our cavalry was well in front, and it was hoped that they might capture the Zulus. At about 8 a.m, having crossed the Nyezane River, we came to the foot of the hill which formed the commencement of the mountainous country in which Eshowe is situated. Here the road took a somewhat semicircular sweep up the hill, and this was commanded on either side by one of much greater height, the bases of which were covered with thin bush. As the engineers under Wynne prepared the banks for the crossing of the wagons, they heard the distinct sound of gunfire ahead of them. Captain Hart's men, lightly armed and scouting forward of the main body, had chanced upon the Zulu left horn, hidden in the long grass on Wombane Hill, or Magia's Hill as the British referred to it. Spurred prematurely into action, the Zulus went straight into the attack. Hart recalled, "Suddenly a mass of Zulus appeared on the hilltop to our left and opened a fire of musketry upon us at a distance of about 400 yards. I saw at once that we had almost fallen into a trap, and I instantly gave the order, 'Retire!' At the same moment the Zulus poured down the hill by hundreds, at the top of their speed, with a tremendous shout. while others above kept up the fire over our heads of those descending the hill. The kloof, which is like a sort of valley, was not far behind us, and we reached it as far as I could perceive without any loss, although the bullets whistled amongst us and struck the earth all about us as we went. Hart had had to take a detour towards the attacking Zulus in order to steer his horse around the kloof. To his horror, most of the white NCOs under his command tried to withdraw through the thick bush of the kloof and were assegaied to death either by their pursuers or by Zulus who were already hidden in the kloof waiting for them. Seeing the fight develop, Pearson quickly deployed the advanced elements of his column, mainly consisting of 2 companies of the Buffs and the men of the Royal Engineers. The artillery also went into action, the loud booms of their guns making the ground shake. G. Baskerville was one of the engineers who was busy at the river, and he takes up the story. I think he was Irish, but I'm not going to attempt an Irish accent, so here goes. No sooner was the firing heard, and then we threw our picks and shovels down and dashed across the river, and then around to the right into a thick dense bush about 800 yards away. We then soon came into action. We poured in a deadly volley into a thick mass of the enemy, which made them sit up a bit. We then extended out into skirmishing order and kept up a well-sustained fire on the enemy, who did not show any want of pluck, for on several occasions they came as close as 50 yards of the muzzles of our rifles. But these individuals paid for their audacity with their lives. We then advanced on them, but they got around on our right flank and partly in our rear, so we were given the order to retire. No sooner did they see us retiring, when they set up a deafening yell and rushed out of the bush. But we turned around on them and put another volley into them, which checked them for a time. We then had the 2 ranks reversed, one rank one way, the rear rank the other, and did a bit of fighting back to back. After about 15 minutes in that position they turned and fled, for the firing was just too hot for them. It's a great description, isn't it? I mean, they had 2 ranks and there was one facing in each direction. That must have been pretty scary stuff, to be fair. And bear in mind, these were Royal Engineers we're talking about, not experienced infantrymen. Meanwhile, with their left horn checked, the Zulu chest began to advance along the road towards the head of the column. They took possession of a homestead about 400 yards away and used it as a firing point to harass the column, while the right horn also began to deploy. Luckily for the British, as was the case throughout the Zulu War, the Zulus were not great marksmen, and as Lieutenant Knight of the Buffs pointed out, their want of skill may be attributed in a great measure to a misapprehension as to the use of the sights of their rifles. Knowing that when a white man wants to hit an object a long way off he puts up his back sight, they concluded that the effect of so doing is to cause the rifle to shoot harder, and wishing to develop the full powers of their arms at all times, they invariably used their rifles with the back sight up, a misconception to which many a British soldier owes his life. But the battle was far from over, and our trusty friend Captain Hart takes up the story. The Zulu fire was coming into the backs of our troops who were engaged near the gun. I accordingly marched the company I had rallied together with another company of the natives who had been on the advanced guard against the kraal, but the courage of our natives utterly failed. They crouched down under any cover they could find, and after fruitless efforts to make them advance, I called upon the white men of the 2 companies to go with me without them. We advanced steadily against the kraal by the main road. The officers, except myself, dismounted, and the little party used their rifles well, and did as I directed, halting to fire and advancing again when I gave the word. Thus we approached the kraal. It was a small kraal, but it occupied a very advantageous position. The enemy covered by it could fire a quarter of a mile down the road. As we approached, the enemy retreated from the kraal, except a few men who remained almost until we reached it. Not one of our party was killed or wounded in the taking of the kraal, but several dead bodies of the enemy there showed that our fire had been more effective. I at once set the kraal on fire, and as the flames shot high into the air in consuming the huts, we gave a loud cheer, "Hurrah!" And I trusted that the flames and the cheer would as much dispirit the enemy as they would exhilarate our men. Fleet Surgeon Norbury of the Naval Brigade continues the story. The naval brigade continued to advance with great intrepidity, but their fire seemed to have no effect in dislodging the Zulus from the ridges in front. It was then determined to make a charge up the hill and along the ridges. At this time the Bluejackets were reinforced by a company of the Buffs under Lieutenant Colonel Parnell, whose horse was immediately shot from under him. Captain Campbell commanded the naval brigade, behaved with much gallantry. He called to the men to follow him and close with the enemy, and then, accompanied by Captain Hart of the Natal Native Regiment, galloped towards the Zulu position. Hart seems to have been all over the place, and he carries on the story now. The summit of Magea's Hill was now before me, about 200 yards off, and the enemy, though still firing upon us from it, were now reduced to a small group who held their ground. My little pony plodded steadily on. They were now but half a dozen white men, and so perseveringly had they clambered up the steep ascent that the Buffs and the naval brigade were now at least 50 yards behind us. 200 yards more and the position would be ours. I urged my men to their utmost speed and charged forward on horseback at the group of Zulus on the summit. They fled all but one man. He stood leaning forward, watching me intently, his left hand on his knee and his rifle ready in his right. I could see glistening on his head the black ring that signifies in Zululand a married man. The Zulu monarch forbids men to marry till they are 40 years old because he cherishes a large and well-organised army, and considers that the attractions of wife and kraal extinguish the martial spirit of his warriors. Here before me was a remarkable exception to that idea. I was rapidly approaching him. He was now only 100 yards distant, and in a few moments I should use my revolver. But just then he dropped quickly on one knee, took very deliberate aim at me for a couple of seconds, and fired. He seemed scarcely to believe he could have missed, for he waited to take one eager look at me as his smoke cleared away, and then, seeing me still coming on, he bolted away and disappeared. Directly afterwards I was on the summit, and saw hundreds of Zulus crowding down the opposite side of the hill in full retreat. I fired my revolver into the crowd and looked around for my men to open fire, but it is one thing to ride up a hill and another to walk up. It was some minutes before they reached me. Then up came the Buffs and the men of the naval brigade. We stood on the quay of the enemy's position. We commanded the whole country around. This the Zulus knew, and they retreated from all quarters. Then from our position we opened a heavy fire upon them in all directions. They swarmed below us, some crowding as fast as they could across the open country, others darting from tree to tree in the kloof below, and many walking on under our fire, apparently with utmost indifference, but probably quite out of breath, I should think. So rapid had been our advance and so unexpected our capture of Magea's Hill that we had surprised all of these masses of men before they could get out of range. It was at about this time that the Gatling gun made its appearance, being used by the British for the first time in anger. The Gatling had been near the rear of the wagons, and it had taken a while for its commander, 19-year-old midshipman Coker, to bring it up near the front of the convoy. It must have been quite a sight in 1879 to see this multi-barrelled hand-cranked weapon opening fire. It was basically the granddaddy of the modern machine gun, and I can only imagine the moment of awe as it commenced firing. The Zulu right horn, which hadn't really been engaged by this point, made a half-hearted attack on the column, but was quickly repulsed. As Norbury writes, "The right horn of the Zulu army was met by a company of the Buffs and the Royal Engineers under Captain Wynne, who first checked its advance and then slowly but determinedly drove it back, following it in skirmishing order through the bush for a long distance. One of the rocket tubes of the Naval Brigade and the guns of the Royal Artillery posted on the knoll played on part of the chest of the Zulu army and on the right horn, some of the shells bursting with great accuracy. The Zulus at some length began to give way, and they retired over the hills in comparatively good order." So it's worth pointing out that rockets at this time were also quite a bizarre weapon, essentially a large and unwieldy firework that made a terrifying noise, sent out showers of sparks, but were generally inaccurate and often dangerous to the men firing them. When they landed amongst their targets, though, they could inflict horrific burns. Coker and his team with a Gatling gun managed to get about 300 rounds downrange before the Zulus finally began to break off the engagement and disperse. The battle was finished by 9:30 in the morning. It had been a short, sharp fight. 12 men on the British side were killed and 20 injured. As usual, it's hard to give an exact figure for Zulu dead and wounded, but estimates put the figure of the Zulu dead at around 300 to 600, which is quite a large proportion of those involved in the battle. A Zulu warrior later recalled that, in his words, "The battle was so fierce that we had to wipe the blood and brains of the killed and wounded from our heads, faces, arms, legs and shield after the fighting." And Hart himself was clearly impressed by his enemy. He says, "The Zulus fought well, showing judgment and courage quite equal to their enemy, but although they outnumbered us greatly, they could not hold their ground against our artillery and superior rifles. We had the best rifles in the world, they, for the most part, merely muskets, weapons of the past." As you can hear, I'm recording this in my back garden. That's the sound of the hardy-dar flying over here in Johannesburg. Before moving on, the British dead were buried in a large grave under some trees on the left of the road. A wooden cross was later placed on the site, and today, if you look hard, you can still find a newer memorial stone. On the blog post that accompanies this episode on my website redcoathistory.com, you can find a video tour of all the battlefields discussed in this episode, including Nyezane. I was lucky enough to visit there a few years ago, and although I now have more information about the battle, I think you'll still get a good view of the battlefield and get to understand the ground better. So the battle had been a decisive British victory. Despite being caught by surprise, Pearson and his men had reacted well, quickly brought their artillery into action, and had been able to mount a successful series of counterattacks against a superior enemy. The Battle of Nyezane had played out exactly as the British would have expected, and if it wasn't for the disaster taking place across the country at Isandlwana on the same day, I have no doubt that this battle would be better remembered. Around noon the next day, on the 23rd of January, the column reached Eshowe. Norbury describes the location of the old mission station. "It consisted of a neat brick-built church with a vestry attached, and having a small tower, the whole roofed with corrugated iron, a long building containing several rooms, one of which had been used as a school, and a third building with a veranda which was a private residence. Both the latter were covered with neat reed thatch. In front of the residence was a magnificent garden, through which ran a fine avenue of orange trees, leading down to a stream of the clearest running water, which had its source in a spring about 200 yards distant. Situated about 300 yards off on the south and east were two small cottages. This mission station was situated on an extensive plateau nearly 2,000 feet above sea level, and was commanded on every side except the southwest by low hills distant only from 300 to 400 yards. So the engineers amongst you will know that for a fort to be overlooked by nearby hills is never a good thing, and under the command of Captain Wynne, the senior engineer, the troops immediately began fortifying the location. Though at this point it was only expected to be used as a depot for stores, and nobody suspected they would have to stay there for a long time. That all changed, though, with the arrival of a telegram at 9 a.m. on the 28th of January. I can only imagine the moment when Pearson read the following message from Lord Chelmsford. It said, "Consider all my instructions as cancelled, and action in whatever manner you think most desirable in the interests of the column under your command. Should you consider the garrison of Eshowe as too far advanced to be fed with safety, you can withdraw it. Hold, however, if possible, the post on the Zulu side of the lower Tugela. You must be prepared to have the entire Zulu force down upon you." At this point, the men in Eshowe didn't have any more details, but it was clear that the situation in Zululand had changed, and that they were now in a very precarious situation. Captain Hart remembered. "There was no time to be lost. Colonel Pearson called the commanding officers together, and it was decided to hold the post, but that, as the place would probably be invested by the enemy for many weeks, the whole of the irregular cavalry and native contingent, i.e. the 2 battalion of Graves Regiment, to which I was attached, should at once retire to the Tugela, to enable the provisions at the post to hold out long enough, and they were to endeavour to cut their way through the enemy should he be found to have intercepted them, as was not improbable, between Eshowe and the Tugela. By lunchtime the same day, the column, consisting of the NNC and most of the cavalry, left the fort and was on the move back the way they had come. After a nervy but generally uneventful journey, they reached safety. Hart describes the journey. At last this weary march of 30 miles approached the end. It was 2 hours past midnight when we reached Fort Tenedos, as it is called, after the crew of HMS Tenedos who made it. It's the fort which covers the passage of the drift of the Tugela, here on the Zulu side. We unsaddled our horses and let them loose, and lay down on the dewy ground outside the fort. We had no kit, so we had no preparations to make for our repose. Saddles made pillows, but that gave us all a sound and refreshing sleep. Next day our natives deserted. They said the Zulus were going to enter Natal, and that their wives and children and cattle would be captured in their absence, so they laid down all government property that had been issued to them, and departed without leave to their kraals. Thus, up to the 13th of February, there was a complete collapse of Graves' regiment. Back at Eshowe, the remaining troops set about strengthening their position for the expected Zulu assault. The men set about to work with alacrity to complete the earthworks, says Norbury. All our baggage, boxes of biscuits, bags of mealies, tents, tent bags were filled with earth, and even articles of clothing rolled up were placed together to form temporary defences. The church and the vestry were loopholed, and all the outlying tents removed to within the enclosure. The 4 7-pounder guns, 2 of which belonged to the Naval Brigade, the Gatling and the rocket tubes were placed in position. The church tower, from which a very extensive general view could be obtained, was used as a lookout, and one of the signalmen with his telescope was stationed therein. I placed all the sick and wounded on stretchers inside the church, which I fitted up as a hospital. Everything available which could possibly be made to hold water was filled in case the Zulus should contaminate the spring or temporarily cut us off from it. At the beginning of February, a messenger arrived with the full details of the disaster at Nyezane. The mood in the camp became angry, and many hoped that the Zulus would attack so they could get their revenge. But they didn't, and the garrison now settled down for a long, drawn-out, self-imposed siege, the monotony only broken by the church bell ringing to warn of a Zulu approach. A handful of mounted men had been left behind, and they nicknamed themselves the Uhlans, and these would sally out from the fort in the morning and occupy posts a few hundred metres away, the furthest one being on a feature they called Observatory Hill. From there they would sometimes patrol the neighbouring ridges and try to gain any valuable information that they could. King Cetshwayo, meanwhile, was livid that Pearson and his men had remained in Zululand, and so he kept a strong force of around 5,000 warriors in the vicinity. They never besieged the fort in a way that we would imagine. There were no trenches, no artillery, and only a handful of marksmen to take potshots at anybody they caught in the open. But what Pearson and his men didn't know was that the Zulu army had been shattered by the 2 battles on the 22nd of January at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. Casualties had been in the thousands, and for a relatively small army with no chance of fresh reinforcements, that was a staggering number, and they had no stomach for another large battle, especially attacking an entrenched British position. Cetshwayo hoped that his troops could lure the garrison into the open and defeat them outside the walls. Rorke's Drift had shown him the folly of attacking prepared defences. But while they weren't willing to launch a full-scale attack, they did continue to harass the garrison, making it almost impossible for runners with messages to make it back and forth to the Tugela, or for fresh supplies to be sent up. Their success in isolating the garrison is reflected in the tone of a quote from Colonel Pearson. Clearly angry with them and desperate for a stand-up fight, he said of the Zulus, "They will get no quarter with us. Remember, number 3 column will be our war cry, and I long for nothing better than to see the country laid to waste and strewn with black carcasses." As the initial excitement ended, the dreary monotony of life for the garrison began to set in. Lieutenant Hamilton of the Naval Brigade describes the daily routine. In the meantime, life here is dull enough. We have working parties at the works all day, commencing at 6 a.m, finishing at 4:30 p.m. No one is allowed to go out of sight of the fort, so our walks are rather limited. We all live inside. Tents have been done away with, but we are fortunate in having a house in our part of the fort, in the veranda of which 10 officers sleep at night. The men have rigged up a shelter for themselves with a wagon cover, and under which half of them sleep at night. The other half sleep on the ramparts and are ready at a moment's notice in case of a night attack. With little else to do, the defences of the fort were improved and became more and more sophisticated. A ditch was dug around the perimeter with a drawbridge, sharp stakes were planted, wire entanglements laid down, and the wagons were piled with sandbags and used as traverses, which are internal barricades that prevent crossfire. Anything outside the perimeter that could give cover or concealment to the Zulus was cleared and demolished, and distances were measured and markers laid down to improve accuracy of fire. The cattle, though, struggled for pasture, and as the siege wore on they had to go further and further from the fort to find pasturage. The Zulus would do little more than take pot shots or shout insults and joke. "Mind and take care of our king's cattle," they would shout, or "We're soon coming for them." The troops would also have the occasional foray to a nearby kraal where they would collect pumpkins or mealies. The Zulus would shout, "If you come and eat our pumpkins, we'll come into Eshowe and drink your coffee." And inevitably, when so many men are living in cramped conditions, sickness began to take its toll. On the 1st of February, Private Kingston of the Buffs became the first man to die of fever. Norbury, who of course was a doctor, let's not forget, gives us an explanation of what he thought were the causes of the illness. While his science might be a bit off, he certainly paints a colourful picture of what it was like there. "Towards the end of February," he says, "a great deal of sickness began to be present in the fort, principally remittent fever and dysentery, which was not to be wondered at when we considered the circumstances which obtained there. The soil at Eshowe was of an unhealthy nature, and the spot would never have been selected as a site for a permanent camp by one versed in sanitary science. But it was imperative that this consideration should yield to military necessity. The wet season was also at its height, and the ground became saturated every few days, and then a burning sun would cause a copious exhalation. The men lived and slept beneath the shelters formed of the wagon tarpaulins, which consisted of boiled canvas, and these, beside being waterproof, were also airproof. The result was that the malarious emanations from the ground could not escape, and it became mingled with the exhalations from the bodies of men, so closely packed together it produced a poisonous atmosphere. Other causes of sickness were a very heavy work, which was required of the men under the broiling sun when on a reduced diet." As you can tell, it was a tough existence there for the men. There might not have been a lot of action, but it wasn't pleasant for them. They did have a decent-ish supply of food, though ammunition was quite low. At the start of the siege there was 340 rounds per man, but as the siege wore on, the constant low-level skirmishes began to deplete that number. To boost morale, every day the bands of the Buffs and the 99th Regiment would put on a show, and there were even games of lawn tennis and cricket. While unpleasant, this wasn't quite the Siege of Lucknow, a battle we will explore in a future episode of the Redcoat History podcast. Meanwhile, Lord Chelmsford, still reeling from the defeat of the Central Column at Isandlwana, had returned to Pietermaritzburg to work out how best to continue the campaign. His requested reinforcements slowly began to arrive, though with Britain also fighting a war in Afghanistan, the army was becoming overstretched. The relief of Eshowe was Chelmsford's main priority, and once his force was big enough he was determined to succeed. With no runners able to get through to Eshowe and limited knowledge of the countryside across the Tugela, Chelmsford called upon the services of a white Zulu chief called John Donne. Donne is a fascinating character. Born in 1834, he became a guide and hunter, learned to speak fluent Zulu, and ended up fighting for the losing side in the brutal Zulu Civil War of 1856. He was nearly killed in the slaughter that followed Cetshwayo's victory against his brother Mbuyazi. As he later said himself, "I was besieged from all sides by men clinging to me, so that my horse was completely rooted to the spot. I now jumped off, stripped myself, and taking nothing but my gun, swam with one hand." But I guess in an early case of white privilege, his skin made him stand out, and he was noticed by King Cetshwayo for his bravery. Cetshwayo then offered him a senior role, which saw him become a chief of the area around the lower Tugela. His job was vetting traders and travellers, as well as obtaining firearms for the king. And he ended up having 49 black wives. He became a wealthy man and lived a bizarre life that straddled the two worlds, equally as comfortable in Zulu dress or European tweed. At the start of the war, he had hoped to remain neutral. He had brought his cattle across the river into Natal, but as we all know, if you sit in the middle of the road, eventually you get ran over. Chelmsford and Dunn met when the two men crossed paths in late February. Realising that a British victory was inevitable, Dunn unhappily accepted the role of head of intelligence and joined Chelmsford's relief force alongside nearly 250 of his armed retainers. I can't help but feel slightly sorry for Dunn. He was left with no choice but to turn on his friend and king, and I'm sure it was a decision that haunted him until the end of his days. Almost immediately it became clear how important he and his men were, where one of them, called Magumbi, was able to cross the border and return with detailed and ultimately correct information regarding the Zulu dispositions. It's also clear that whatever you may think of Lord Chelmsford, and he certainly has a lot of critics, the man did learn a lot of valuable lessons from his defeat at Isandlwana. Just before the column advanced, he sent around a memorandum to his officers. It laid out many important points, including: companies must be held together in close order. Files must loosen out but not be extended. Each wagon and cart with the convoy must have some ammunition boxes placed on it in such a position as to be easily got at. The regimental reserve boxes must have the screw of the lid taken out, and each wagon or cart will have a screwdriver attached to one of the boxes. Each regiment must take its proper proportion of entrenching tools, and those with the advanced portion of the column must be so placed as to be easily got at when the road requires repair. No tents will accompany the relieving column, except one or two bell tents for hospital purposes. The force will form a square laager of wagons every night. Combined parties of 6 Europeans and 6 natives will be placed half a mile in advance of each face of the laager at night as outlying sentries. Native scouts, however, will be pushed forward at least a mile. These parties will remain on the alert, no smoking, no talking above a whisper, and only regarding matters of duty. Their duty is to listen. He was determined, as he prepared for the advance on Eshowe, that there would be no repeat of the disaster of Isandlwana. On the 29th of March at 6 a.m, Chelmsford set off from Fort Pearson. He had a strong force with him that included the 57th and 91st Regiments, 6 companies of the 3rd Battalion 60th, 5 companies of the 99th, 2 of the Buffs, plus a naval brigade, some mounted infantry and local volunteers, as well as the 4th and 5th battalions of the Natal native contingent. Chelmsford would have been happy to have received his reinforcements, fresh troops like the 91st, straight out of England. But the reality was that they were mainly young, inexperienced, and had no chance to acclimatise to the extreme weather, sounds and smells of South Africa. In total, the column numbered around 5,500 men, as well as 2 more Gatling guns and 4 rocket tubes. It was a sunny day as the men left, much needed to dry off the men after a wet and miserable night in the rain. The eventual advance towards Eshowe took a slightly different route to that taken by Pearson in January. They marched closer to the coast through more open country, but the recent heavy rain meant that the progress was slow. The Zulus, under the command of a chief named Somopo, realised they had to act before the relief force could get through to Eshowe. His impi numbered around 10,000 men, including elements of the Uve, Ingobamakosi, Umhlanga, Umbonambi, Umhijo, and Utulwana regiments. Many of these men were veterans of Isandlwana. If you listened to episode 2 about that battle at Isandlwana, then you may recall the embedded journalist Charles Norris Newman of the Standard, who accompanied the Central Column during the invasion and was with Chelmsford when the massacre at the camp happened. Here he describes the countryside that the column advanced through. "Hitherto," he says, "the column had traversed rolling grassy plains with gentle slopes, wooded knolls and small streams at intervals. We now entered a more wooded country with large patches of high and strong tambuki grass bordering the road and many treacherous and boggy places which had to be crossed or circumvented as best as could be done. On this day's," Tuesday's, "march, it was found necessary to make occasional halts to allow the column and convoy to close up, and on 2 occasions the regiments in front were sent out in extended order to sweep through the long grass and lumps of bushes so as to avoid any ambush or counter-attack." Eventually a spot was chosen to lager up for the night. It was on the summit of a slight knoll close to the Nyezane river and near the abandoned village of Gingindlovu. If you visit my website, redcoathistory.com, for the full show notes, I've posted maps and also a video of the battlefield from when I visited a couple of years ago. It's a lovely spot, quite close to the main road, but otherwise little changed. Another of our old friends, Captain Fitzroy Hart, was now working as a staff officer and accompanied the advance. He says, "On Tuesday, the 1st of April, we advanced to the locality where I am now writing, Gingindlovu, and there formed lager as usual. Our lager was nearly a square of about 150 yards aside, formed by the wagons drawn close together. Inside there were cattle, outside there was a square entrenchment, leaving a space about 20 yards wide between the wagons and the entrenchment. In this space were the troops, the guns and the rocket tubes, all in assigned places." It was quite a formidable position for a temporary halt, but one thing the men didn't have time to do was to cut down the long grass and give themselves a better field of fire around the position. Ian Knight, one of the preeminent historians on the Anglo Zulu War, explains the troop dispositions within the lager in his book Fearful Hard Times. "The 60th formed the front of the camp," he says, lining the northeastern ramparts, with the 99th and the Buffs on the left face and the 57th on the right. The 91st was situated at the rear. The naval brigades with their artillery were positioned in the corners, the native contingent well placed behind the 91st. The night was a nervy one. Large campfires of the Zulu impi were visible in a valley some way off. It rained heavily, and most of the men were unable to sleep, leaving them tired and a little depressed. John Dunn and a captain called Molyneux rode down to the river to recce the position. Dunn, who knew the area well, stripped off and swam across the surging river. He returned later, freezing cold but confident that the Zulus would attack in the morning. Norris Newman takes up the story. "On Wednesday morning, April the 2nd, our scouts and mounted natives were sent out on patrol at sunrise, shortly after 5. Rising at 05:30, I fancied I heard a few shots in the distance, but paid no particular attention to it. And meanwhile preparations were made for grazing cattle and getting breakfast, as the general had decided that the column should remain encamped all day, and that on the day following he would take a part of the column and making march on Eshowe to bring away Colonel Pearson's forces to our camp." Captain Hart describes what happened next. "About 6 o'clock, a shout ran around the entrenchment. 'Stand to your arms!' The bugle sounded the alarm and everyone bounded into his place. Directly afterwards, shots were fired by our outposts and we saw them retiring upon the entrenchment. Soon they were all inside with us. Close by me was one of our natives, his eyes fixed with the look of a hawk, while with one hand he pointed towards the Nyezane valley and said to me, 'Impi.' I looked there and saw what might have been mistaken for a streak of bush, bordering stream and disappearing back into the distance miles away. But it wasn't bush. A few instants of observation showed that it was in motion. It was a stream of black men rapidly approaching our position from our left front. It was a Zulu army." The Zulus quickly deployed into their classic Horns of the Bull formation, the left and right wings extending around the British to encircle them. As Fitzroy Hart later wrote, it was a marvellous sight. "Then began the most splendid piece of skirmishing the eye ever beheld," he said. "No whites ever did or ever could skirmish in the magnificent perfection of the Zulus. Unencumbered by much clothing, in the prime of life and as brave as it is possible for any man to be, they bounded forward towards us from all sides, rushing from cover to cover, gliding like snakes through the grass, firing upon us always from concealment." Inside the laager, British officers shouted their orders. "No independent firing! Volleys by companies!" They knew that massed volley fire would break the Zulus, and that independent firing led to inexperienced troops wasting ammunition. There was one problem with volley fire, though, and that was the cloud of smoke it raised, blinding the men. As the battle wore on, many units began firing volleys by sections to aid with visibility. Another of our old friends from episodes 1 and 2 is Commandant Hamilton Brown of the NNC. He was also present at Gingindlovu and describes the work of the Naval Brigade. Now, the Bluejackets, or rather a portion of them, had taken charge of the right front of the laager, and in their usual make-yourself-at-home handy sort of way, had constructed out of their kit bags and anything else they could get hold of a rough sort of bastion, in which they had planted a Gatling gun. And as I had no men to look after, and had never before seen the machine gun in my life, I went over to their post to watch it at work, and was much struck by the cool daredevil bearing and splendid self-reliance of my old friends whom the Maoris years before had called the Ngati Jacks, who were, as they always have been in the past, and please God always will be in the future when in action, thoroughly enjoying themselves, as it is only a right and proper frame of mind for men to be in when they are doing work for King and the flag. He was less impressed, though, with the inexperienced infantrymen of the 60th, who he claimed nearly bolted after the death of their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Northey. He went on to say, "Comparisons are, I know, odious, but to no impartial looker-on that day could have been present without being strongly impressed with the difference between the conduct of the mature bluejacket and the half-baked nervous boys in whose company they were fighting." In other words, the red-coated infantrymen. Dr. Henry Cook Lyndon was a civilian doctor serving with the column. His letter, which later appeared in the Belfast News in May 1879, gives a sense of the ferocity of the fight. "We opened a heavy volley fire on them when at about 1,000 yards off the trenches. The two 14-pounders being quickly brought to bear on them, but notwithstanding the heavy fire kept up on our side, it was warmly returned, the bullets coming over our heads and in amongst us in showers. The enemy still came on with undaunted bravery, some of them approaching as near as 20 yards to the Gatling guns, of which we had 2. Hamilton Brown spotted one Zulu make it all the way to the bastion in front of the Naval Brigade. He says, "Where one of the bluejackets spotted him, leaned over, grabbed him by the nape of the neck and collected him, kicking and squirming inside the work, where after he had been cuffed into a state of quietude, his captor kept him prisoner by sitting on him till the end of the engagement. This youthful cornerman, preserved alive, was adopted by the crew of HMS Boadicea as a mascot, and if I remember rightly, was subsequently entered into the Royal Navy." I thought that was quite an interesting anecdote, actually. I've read elsewhere that he was a very young man, probably a sort of servant of one of the warriors involved in the attack. Meanwhile, Norris Newman seems to have gotten a bit carried away and forgotten any sense of journalistic integrity and neutrality, as he took his rifle, climbed onto a wagon and spent the battle taking potshots at the Zulus. He wasn't the only non-combatant involved in such a way, as Hamilton Brown recalled. "I was at this time greatly amused at the tactics of an immensely big and fat old Dutchman, one of the grand old Trek Boers, who, although he had not seen his knees for ages, was as full of fight as an old buck goat. He fought comfortably, for sitting on the padded driving box of his wagon with a case of ammunition on one side of him and a big square rigger of gin, mightily convenient on the other. He picked off Zulu after Zulu with the rapidity of a boy looting a cherry tree, while every time he made a shot he deemed worthy to be commemorated, he would treat himself to a sip of gin, chuck a chuckle, and rub with gusto the elephantine protuberance that occupied the locality of his anatomy, which in his youth he had called his waist. I thought that was a rather amusing little tale. By 6:45 in the morning, the attack was beginning to falter, and Chelmsford, stalking along the sides of the laager in his distinctive red nightcap, ordered his mounted infantry to leave the position and counterattack. Major Barrow led the sortie in person. After a few shots, the Zulus turned and fled, but were quickly caught up and dispatched by the sabres of the men. Major Barrow was slightly wounded in the thigh, but the casualty numbers were low. Captain Hart takes up the story again. "And now our 2,000 natives rushed out of our entrenchments, and after one vigorous effort of the Zulus to stop the sortie by wheeling up and firing into the right flank of the advancing troops, they turned and fled. But their bravest men had not the breath to run away, and they perished." His next sentence is quite telling, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. He says, "Let me draw a veil over that part of the scene. Chivalry ends when pursuit begins, but the dire necessities of war oblige that a defeated army also be dispersed, so that it will never fight again. It is called consummating the victory." The battle was now as good as over. Those elements of the Zulu army that hadn't been engaged realised that they had pressing engagements elsewhere. British dead from the battle were 2 officers and 11 men, with a further 4 officers and 44 men wounded. When I visited the battlefield a couple of years ago, a local farmer approached me. He showed me bullets and bones that he still regularly ploughed up in the fields, testament to the ferocity of the fight. As usual, though, it's always hard to gauge Zulu casualties exactly, but estimates range from between 500 to 1,000 dead. A staggering number for an army that was now overstretched, exhausted, and facing a British force that was growing every day, and now was beginning to get a momentum of victory behind them. It must have been with a sickening sense of dread that the Zulu warrior saw the devastating effects of laagered troops supported by Gatling guns and artillery. No amount of bravery was going to suffice for them. Isandlwana was already beginning to feel like a distant memory. The road to Eshowe was now open, and on the morning of the 3rd of April, Chelmsford led a large part of his force 15 miles across rough ground, crisscrossed by streams and thick with swamps. With them was a number of journalists keen for a scoop, but Norris Newman, as ever, was determined to be the first man to reach the fort. He explains what happened next. "It was 4:30 p.m, and as we were nearing Eshowe, I rode off to the front to get ahead and to be the first into the fort if possible, remembering that Colonel Pearson had made a new road, shortening the way and avoiding the vicinity of the Hinza forest. Profiting by this shortcut, I had the pleasure of being the first man of the column to shake Colonel Pearson by the hand." I can only imagine the absurdity of this moment. After waiting for the best part of 3 months to be relieved, the first man to get through to the fort was a rather smug journalist. Somewhat of an anticlimax, I should think. At around 7:15, under a beautiful blue moon, there was a loud hurrah all along the parapet as Lord Chelmsford arrived. The pipers of the 91st Highlanders broke into a rendition of "The Campbells Are Coming," and the siege was now finally over. Chelmsford had already decided that the fort at Eshowe would now need to be abandoned, as it served no great strategic purpose in his upcoming plans for the war. After a night of easy relaxation, a good meal and plenty of jokes, the wagons were loaded with anything that could be taken away, and anything that couldn't and may be useful to the Zulus was destroyed. It was now time for a long, slow march back to the Tugela and the next stage of the war. Well, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this little-known part of the Anglo Zulu War. Eshowe is largely forgotten, as are the battles of Nyezane and Gingindlovu, but they were nevertheless very important and paved the way for the eventual British victory. We will meet many of the men from today's story again soon, as a fresh invasion of Zululand is on the cards. In the next episode, I will regale you with the stories of the Northern Column. We'll visit the battlefields of Ntombe Drift, Hlobane Mountain and Kambula. Epic fights that I'm really looking forward to describing. In the meantime, please do subscribe and leave me a comment, as it really helps others to find the show. Until then, clean your Martini Henrys, patch up your uniforms, and I'll see you again soon under a huge blue sky as a swarm of determined foes charge towards us, just the way we like it.